She burst into the police station, drenched from the storm, clutching a tiny newborn in her trembling arms, screaming, "Please, save my baby." For a moment, everyone thought it was hers. Officer Daniel Harris froze, his loyal K-9, Shadow, alert at his side. The little girl, just 6 years old, had walked miles alone through the freezing night. Her tear-streaked face, her shaken hands, and the desperate way she held that fragile life told a story of something far darker than anyone could imagine. Where was the mother? Why was this child carrying a newborn through the storm? And what Daniel uncovered next would shatter everything they thought they knew. As you listen, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from today? Now, let's begin. The freezing rain hammered against the small town of Maple Creek, where the wind howled through empty streets and lampposts flickered weakly against the darkness. Inside the Maple Creek Police Department, the low hum of an old heater filled the quiet station until, suddenly, the door slammed open with a violent gust of wind and icy droplets. A small figure stumbled in. A little girl, no older than 6, completely drenched from head to toe. Her tangled chestnut-brown hair clung to her pale cheeks, and her thin arms trembled as she clutched a patchwork quilt so tightly it seemed stitched into her skin. Her hazel eyes, wide and glistening with tears, locked on the nearest officer. Between ragged breaths, her voice cracked into a desperate plea. "Please, save my baby." For a brief moment, the room froze in silence. Officer Daniel Harris shot up from behind the front desk. 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, Daniel had the sturdy build of someone who had spent years in the military before finding his place in law enforcement. His short, dark brown hair was slightly damp from his earlier patrol, and a faint layer of stubble framed his strong jawline. His blue-gray eyes, tired but sharp, softened as they locked onto the trembling little girl. Years in the Marines had shaped him into someone steady under pressure, but seeing a child in such distress stirred something deeper, a buried instinct to protect. Beside him, his loyal K-9 partner, Shadow, reacted instantly. Shadow, a 4-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur, moved with silent precision, his amber eyes locked on the girl as if he understood her fear. The scar across his right paw, a remnant from an old training injury, did nothing to dull his sharp instincts. Tail stiff, ears forward, Shadow waited for Daniel's command, every muscle coiled with alertness. Daniel rushed forward, kneeling in front of the little girl. Lowering his deep voice to a gentle tone, he asked softly, "Hey, it's okay. You're safe here. What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl's lip trembled as she tried to speak, clutching the bundle in her arms even tighter. Sophie Miller," she whispered between shaky breaths. Daniel's gaze dropped to the quilt, soaked and clinging to the small body inside. He carefully lifted one corner and froze. Nestled within was a tiny newborn baby boy, barely a few days old. The baby's face was flushed, his lips dry, and his faint whimpers sounded weaker than they should have been. Daniel glanced back at the front desk, his voice sharp and urgent now. "Call medical now," he barked to the other officers. "We've got an infant in distress." Sophie's breaths came in short, shallow gasps, her entire body trembling beneath the soaked fabric of her sweater. She clung to the bundle so fiercely that Daniel had to gently ease her small fingers apart. Her words spilled out in fragments, shaky and uneven. He won't drink milk since this morning," Sophie stammered through tears, her voice breaking as she tried to catch her breath. "Grandma tried, but she can't." She forgets things now. And Mom, her chest heaved as a sob escaped her lips. Mom's gone. She said she's getting better. Daniel swallowed hard, keeping his composure even as his chest tightened at the sight of the little girl's fear. Slowly, he removed his jacket and draped it around her tiny shoulders, speaking in a low, steady tone meant to anchor her. You're safe here, Sophie. You did the right thing. We're going to take care of him. I promise. As Daniel leaned closer to examine the newborn, Shadow padded silently to Sophie's side. The K9 pressed his warm head against her shaken knee, letting out a low, soft whine. Sophie hesitated, then buried her trembling hand into Shadow's thick fur, gripping it like a lifeline. For the first time since stepping into the station, she drew a steadier breath. Daniel gently adjusted the damp quilt to better support the baby's fragile body, his sharp eyes scanning the infant's pale skin, tiny fists, and parched lips. And then, in an instant, his trained instincts screamed at him. Something was dangerously wrong. The baby's skin was clammy, his breathing shallow, and his lips were cracked. As Daniel brushed a finger gently along the infant's cheek, his chest tightened with realization. The newborn was dehydrated. Without wasting a second, Daniel grabbed his radio and barked into it with controlled urgency. Get paramedics here now. We've got a newborn in critical condition. The rain had slowed to a cold drizzle outside the Maple Creek Police Department. But inside, tension still hung heavy in the air. The tiny infant, Noah, lay swaddled in a clean blanket, his breathing steadier now after receiving an oxygen mask and warm fluids from the paramedics. Little Sophie Miller sat curled up on the wooden bench, her damp clothes clinging to her thin frame, her small hands twisted nervously around the silver star-shaped locket at her neck, rubbing it so hard that the delicate edges left faint marks on her fingers. Shadow, the black and tan German shepherd, lay close to her feet, his amber eyes watching Sophie with quiet vigilance, occasionally nudging her knee as if to remind her she wasn't alone. The station door opened softly, and a woman stepped inside. Caroline Brooks, a social worker with over 15 years of experience in child protection, moved with quiet confidence. In her late 30s, Caroline had shoulder-length chestnut hair pulled neatly into a low ponytail, olive-toned skin, and warm hazel eyes framed by rectangular glasses. Her navy trench coat was damp from the weather, but her posture remained composed, almost protective. Years of witnessing broken families and neglected children had hardened her resolve, but not her compassion. Daniel Harris rose to greet her, his tall frame casting a shadow under the dim fluorescent lights. "Caroline," he said, his deep voice low but firm, "we've got a 6-year-old who walked through a storm carrying her newborn brother. Mother's absent, grandmother's reportedly unwell, infant's in fragile condition. You'll want to hear this." Caroline nodded, her expression softening as her gaze fell on Sophie. She crouched down slowly, lowering herself to the child's level, her voice gentle and steady. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Caroline. I'm here to help you and your brother, okay?" Sophie hesitated, but eventually gave a slight nod, her lips trembling. She clutched her locket tighter, as though drawing courage from it. Caroline noticed the intricate design of the pendant, a tiny silver star, slightly tarnished with age, hanging from a delicate chain. "That's a beautiful necklace you have," Caroline murmured softly, careful not to pry. Sophie lowered her gaze, whispering almost inaudibly, "Mom said, When the star shines bright again, she'll come back." The simple statement made Caroline's chest tighten, and for a moment she exchanged a silent glance with Daniel, both reading the weight behind the girl's words. It was a promise, one Sophie was clinging to with everything she had left. Caroline settled onto the bench beside Sophie, speaking softly while pulling a small notebook from her bag. "Can you tell me about your brother, Sophie? You seem to know a lot about taking care of him." Sophie unzipped her damp backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Its edges were frayed, and several pages had water stains, but inside were carefully drawn tables, colored boxes, and tiny handwriting that was surprisingly neat for a 6-year-old. "This is Noah's feeding schedule," Sophie explained quietly, tracing one small finger over the times. "He gets his formula at 6:30, 10:30, 2:30, and 6:30. I write down everything, even when he cries." Daniel leaned forward, his blue-gray eyes fixed on the small book, impressed by the precision. He noted how Sophie's careful organization hinted at a child forced to grow up far too quickly. Shadow shifted slightly, laying his head gently against Sophie's foot, sensing her unease. The girl's trembling hand instinctively sank back into his thick fur, her tiny frame leaning toward the warm comfort of the K9. Caroline turned her focus back to the practical matters. "Sophie," she said gently, "I'd like to visit your home later to make sure your grandma and Noah have what they need. Is that okay?" Sophie hesitated, clutching her locket, then nodded slowly. "Grandma's name is Margaret," she whispered. "She forgets things a lot. Some days she knows who I am. Some days she doesn't." Her voice wavered as she said the last word, and Daniel placed a steadying hand on the bench, his presence a silent reassurance. 2 hours later, Daniel, Caroline, Sophie, and Shadow pulled up in front of a small, aging blue house on Maple Street. The siding was weather-worn, the paint peeling, and the porch light flickered weakly against the overcast sky. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of old wood and tea, and sticky notes in various colors were placed across walls, cabinets, and doors, each one neatly labeled in a child's handwriting. Yellow =sign medicine. Blue =sign food. Green =sign important. On the worn sofa by the window sat Margaret Miller, Sophie's 72-year-old grandmother. Her short silver hair framed a gentle but weary face, and her pale blue eyes flickered with both warmth and confusion. She wore a faded cardigan and a mismatched skirt, her thin hands clutching a teacup she had forgotten to drink. At times, her gaze seemed sharp and present, but then it would drift away, clouded, as though she were trapped inside a fog of fractured memories. Caroline approached slowly, kneeling slightly to meet Margaret's line of sight. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Caroline Brooks from Social Services. We're here to make sure you and the children have what you need." Margaret blinked, her expression softening as she took in Sophie standing beside Shadow. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said warmly, voice trembling. "You made it back." But her words trailed off, her gaze growing distant as confusion seeped in. Daniel's sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the empty bottles and unopened formula cans stacked neatly on the kitchen counter. He crouched to examine them, his brows furrowing when he saw none of them had been prepared. Shadow padded beside him, sniffing the edges of the formula containers as though sensing something was amiss. Sophie led Caroline quietly to her small bedroom, a narrow space with pale blue walls and a single twin bed tucked against the corner. On a shelf near the bed sat a small wooden box, locked with a simple clasp. Sophie hesitated for a moment before retrieving it, holding it delicately in her tiny hands. "This is Mom's box," she whispered, offering it carefully to Caroline. Inside were several carefully folded letters, each addressed in graceful handwriting. "To my shooting star." Caroline lifted one, reading the date. Nearly 10 months ago. The letter was from Sophie's mother, Laura Miller, explaining her struggle with addiction and her stay at the Sunrise Recovery Center, a rehabilitation facility 2 towns away. Laura promised she was getting better, swearing she would return for her children once she was strong enough to take care of them. Caroline exhaled slowly, her hazel eyes softening as she placed the letters back in the box, understanding now why Sophie clung so tightly to the locket around her neck. It wasn't just jewelry, it was hope. Daniel stood in the doorway, his broad frame filling the small space, his voice low but steady. "This little girl carried her newborn brother 2 miles in a storm," he said quietly to Caroline. "That's strength no kid her age should ever need." Caroline nodded, closing the box carefully and placing it back in Sophie's small hands. "And that's exactly why we're going to fight to keep them safe," she said firmly. As they prepared to leave the house, Sophie slipped her hand into Shadow's fur, the canine leaning into her side like a silent guardian. The silver star locket glimmered faintly beneath the dim hallway light, a fragile symbol of promises yet to be kept. The gray morning hung heavy over Maple Creek, the chill of last night's storm still lingering in the damp air. Inside the family services office, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights carried an unease that none of the staff could shake. Caroline Brooks sat at the head of the polished oak table, files neatly stacked before her, but her hazel eyes revealed the storm she carried inside. Across from her, Officer Daniel Harris leaned back in his chair, his tall frame tense, one arm resting over the back as if he were bracing for impact. At his feet, Shadow lay alert, the black and tan German Shepherd's amber eyes tracking every small movement, his ears twitching at the low voices echoing through the room. Caroline had spent hours compiling her report after the home visit. Now it was time to present it to the court. She explained Sophie's extraordinary effort to care for Noah, the missing mother, the grandmother's cognitive decline, and the environmental concerns inside the small blue house on Maple Street. Her voice was calm, but Daniel caught the tremor beneath it. She had fought too many battles like this before, and each one left scars no one could see. Sitting at the far end of the table was Harriet Winters, the senior child welfare supervisor. Harriet was a woman in her mid-50s, tall and angular, with sharp, gray-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and pale skin lined with years of stress. Her icy blue eyes scanned the papers in front of her without lifting her chin, and her dark burgundy blazer gave her a commanding presence. Harriet's personality was rigid. Decades of handling difficult cases had hardened her belief in rules and efficiency above all else. She had built a reputation for making tough calls quickly, even when they left others unsettled. "Based on the findings," Harriet said crisply, tapping the edge of Caroline's report with perfectly manicured nails, "I recommend placing Sophie and Noah into foster care immediately. Separate placements would give each child the best opportunity. Noah's a newborn, his adoption prospects are excellent. Sophie is 6. Finding a permanent family for her alongside him will be difficult." Daniel straightened, the muscles in his jaw tightening as his blue-gray eyes narrowed. "Separate placements?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You're talking about breaking up the only stability these kids have left." Harriet met his glare without flinching. "Officer Harris, the goal is long-term permanency. That baby could be adopted by a qualified family within weeks. Sophie's needs are different." Shadow let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, sensing the tension. Caroline reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, grounding herself through the small gesture before speaking. "Harriet," she said, keeping her tone measured, "Sophie carried her brother 2 miles in freezing rain to save his life. They've survived together. Ripping them apart now would traumatize both children." For a moment, silence settled across the room, heavy and unmoving. Then a knock on the door broke the tension. A clerk stepped inside holding a thin folder. "Judge Parker's decision has come through," she announced softly before placing the envelope on the table and exiting. Caroline opened it with careful hands and exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. Judge Henry Parker, a man known for his balanced judgments and compassion, had issued a temporary order. Sophie and Noah would be placed together under the care of Robert and Olivia Henderson, a foster family certified for emergency placements. The relief was tempered by unease. This was temporary, and Harriet's stance remained unchanged. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Caroline drove Sophie and Noah to the Hendersons' home, a cozy 2-story cottage painted pale yellow with white trim, nestled behind a picket fence on the outskirts of town. Sophie sat in the back seat beside Noah's carrier, her small fingers clutching the star-shaped locket so tightly it left faint red marks on her palm. Shadow sat pressed against her legs, his presence grounding her as she stared silently out the window. Robert Henderson, a retired music teacher in his late 60s, greeted them at the door. He was a stocky man with a soft middle, salt and pepper hair combed neatly to the side, and warm brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. His wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose, and his calloused hands hinted at decades spent teaching piano to restless students. Robert's demeanor was gentle, patient, and filled with the kind of kindness that made children feel safe instantly. Beside him stood Olivia Henderson, his wife, a pediatric nurse in her mid-50s. Olivia was tall and slender, with wavy, honey-blonde hair pulled into a loose bun and soft green eyes framed by faint laugh lines. Her lightly freckled skin glowed with warmth, and her voice carried a soothing melody born of years spent calming frightened children in hospital wards. She crouched down to meet Sophie's gaze directly, speaking in a tone as soft as the quilt in her hands. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Olivia. We've prepared a room for you and your brother. You'll both be safe here." Sophie clutched Noah tighter and glanced at Daniel, uncertainty clouding her hazel eyes. She refused to release her brother even for a moment, as though any separation, even inches, might mean losing him forever. Daniel knelt beside her, his deep voice steady. "You're not leaving him, Sophie. Shadow and I will be right here for as long as you need." Shadow, sensing her tension, nudged her hand and licked her knuckles gently, pulling a faint smile from her despite herself. Inside, the Hendersons' home smelled faintly of fresh linen and cinnamon. A small piano stood near the window, sunlight reflecting softly off its polished surface. Robert promised Sophie he would teach her the Song of the Stars when she felt ready, earning the smallest nod from the girl. Olivia led them upstairs to a shared nursery bedroom. The crib was placed carefully beside a twin bed, dressed in a soft quilt patterned with clouds. But later, when Sophie thought no one was watching, Caroline noticed her sitting on the edge of the bed, her legs dangling, her locket clutched in her palm. Her hazel eyes were red-rimmed and fixed on Noah as he slept. The exhaustion written across her small face broke Caroline's heart. That evening, while Olivia prepared bottles and Robert set up a small playmat for Noah, Caroline and Daniel stepped outside to speak privately near the Hendersons' front porch. The air was cool, and the distant hum of cars passing down the street filled the silence. "She's barely holding it together," Daniel said quietly, glancing back toward the house. "Harriet's pushing for separate placements the moment the review comes up. Sophie can't handle that, neither can the baby." Caroline folded her arms, her expression tight but resolved. "Then we fight it. I'll file an appeal and request a psychological assessment. We need documentation proving how dependent they are on each other." Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Shadow and I will back you up." Inside, Sophie finally allowed herself to settle against Shadow's side, curling up on the floor beside the German Shepherd as the dog kept a protective paw draped across her legs. The steady rise and fall of his breathing was the first thing to quiet her racing thoughts since the storm. For now, Sophie and Noah were safe, but everyone in that house knew safety was fragile, and the system waiting outside could still tear them apart. The sun hung low over Maple Creek, casting a pale golden glow across the quiet streets as a light breeze stirred the leaves. 1 month had passed since Sophie and Noah had moved in with the Hendersons, and though the house was warm and safe, Sophie's heart still carried the heavy weight of uncertainty. Today was the day she would see her mother again. But it wasn't home they were driving toward. It was the Maplewood Family Visitation Center, a small brick building tucked between the courthouse and the community park designed for monitored reunions like this. Daniel Harris sat behind the wheel, his broad frame leaning forward slightly, his deep blue-gray eyes focused on the road ahead. Beside him, his loyal K-9 partner, Shadow, lay curled on the passenger side floor, his amber eyes watchful, tail twitching occasionally in quiet anticipation. In the back seat, Sophie sat buckled in next to Noah's infant carrier, clutching the silver star-shaped locket so tightly it left faint indents on her palm. Her hazel eyes darted between the window and the car seat, refusing to look at anyone directly. Caroline Brooks rode with them, seated beside Sophie, holding a thin folder containing the supervised visitation paperwork. Today would be delicate. She adjusted her glasses, glancing at Sophie with a warm but measured expression. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "your mom's been working really hard to get better. She's excited to see you and Noah." Sophie gave no response, her small body tense, her jaw clenched in quiet defiance. Shadow sensed her unease and rested his head gently on her knee from the front seat, earning the smallest, fleeting touch of Sophie's trembling fingers. When they arrived, the visitation center's modest sign creaked slightly in the wind. Inside, the lobby was painted soft shades of cream and pale blue, meant to be calming, though Sophie thought it smelled faintly of disinfectant and sadness. A receptionist with kind brown eyes and short gray curls smiled gently as she checked them in. "Room 3 is prepared," she said softly. In the visitation room, toys were neatly arranged in one corner, and a round wooden table stood in the middle. It was quiet, except for the soft hum of the overhead heater. Sophie slid into the chair closest to Noah's carrier, her small hands twisting the hem of her shirt nervously. Then the door opened, and Laura Miller stepped in. Sophie's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the locket instinctively. Laura, in her early 30s, had once been vibrant, with long, wavy auburn hair and warm hazel eyes like Sophie's, but now she looked fragile. thinner than before, her pale skin almost translucent under the soft lights. Her hair, pulled into a loose braid, had strands falling around her tired face, and deep shadows circled her once bright eyes. Yet, there was something steady in her gaze now, a fragile determination replacing the chaos that had once consumed her. Laura hesitated at the doorway, her trembling hands clutching the straps of a simple canvas bag. When her eyes landed on Sophie and Noah, her lower lip quivered and her breath came out shaky. "Hi, my little shooting star," she whispered softly, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. Sophie looked down at Noah, refusing to answer. The silence between them was suffocating. Laura stepped forward cautiously, her movements slow, as though she feared scaring her daughter away. She crouched near Sophie's chair, keeping her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I'm sorry," Laura said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm trying. I'm fixing myself. I promise, baby." Sophie hugged Noah closer to her chest, her little arms trembling as she whispered, barely audible, "You left." The words landed heavy between them. Laura's face crumpled as she reached forward instinctively, but stopped herself just short of touching Sophie, knowing trust could not be forced. Caroline, sitting nearby, leaned slightly forward, her soft voice steady but firm. "Sophie, your mom has been working very hard. She's at Sunrise Recovery Center now, and she's been clean for over 6 months. She wanted to see you and Noah today to start making things right." Laura nodded, wiping her tears quickly, trying to hold herself together in front of her children. "Everything I'm doing," she whispered, "is so I can come back to you. I want us together again, the way we should be." Sophie's shoulders tensed, and she stared at her mother with a mixture of longing and guardedness. She wanted to believe her. She wanted to run into her arms. But she couldn't forget the nights rocking Noah to sleep alone, the rainstorm, and the fear of losing him. Daniel, leaning silently against the wall, kept his distance, but his presence was grounding. Shadow sat at his side, his sharp ears twitching as he watched Sophie carefully. At one point, Shadow rose and walked over, gently resting his head against Sophie's legs, as though sensing the emotions she couldn't express. Sophie buried her free hand into his thick fur and breathed a little steadier. Caroline guided the room carefully, giving space for quiet but redirecting when needed. They played a soft children's song from a small speaker, filling the silence with something warm. Noah stirred awake in Sophie's arms, tiny fists stretching weakly. Laura's breath hitched when she heard his soft cry, and for the first time since she entered, Sophie allowed her to lean closer. Laura gently touched the baby's blanket with shaking fingers, her voice trembling but tender. "Hey there, little Noah. It's Mommy," she whispered, though her eyes never left Sophie's face, silently pleading for forgiveness. Sophie said nothing, but she didn't pull Noah away. The meeting lasted an hour, though to Sophie it felt much shorter. It ended with Laura quietly promising, "I'll keep getting better. For both of you." Caroline reassured Sophie they would continue supervised visits, but nothing would change immediately. As they prepared to leave, Sophie lingered by the doorway, glancing back at Laura one last time. Her expression was unreadable, but she clutched her locket tightly, as though holding on to the tiny thread of hope it represented. Shadow walked close at her side as Daniel guided them out, the German shepherd lowering his head and brushing his muzzle against Sophie's hand, grounding her in silence. For the first time in weeks, Sophie allowed herself to whisper softly, "Shadow, I'm scared." Shadow pressed closer, as if telling her she wasn't alone. Thunder rumbled low across the night sky above Maple Creek as heavy rain lashed against the town's empty streets. Inside the warm but tense conference room at the Family Services office, voices clashed over the future of Sophie and Noah. The table was crowded with files, legal documents, and cups of half-drunk coffee. Caroline Brooks sat rigidly at one end, her hazel eyes sharp with restrained fury as she faced Harriet Winters, the senior child welfare supervisor. Harriet, in her mid-50s, stood tall in her burgundy blazer, her gray-streaked hair pulled tightly into a bun, her icy blue eyes unwavering. "We have to face facts," she said firmly, tapping a manicured nail against the adoption assessment. "Noah is a newborn, perfectly healthy. He's got a high chance of being adopted by a stable family. Sophie, at 6, complicates things. If we want what's best for the baby, we need to consider separate placements." Daniel Harris, leaning against the wall, clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. His tall, broad frame seemed to loom larger under the harsh fluorescent lights. Shadow sat obediently by his side, the 4-year-old German shepherd's black and tan fur glistening faintly where raindrops from the storm had dampened his coat earlier. Shadow's amber eyes tracked the rising tension as though ready to act if needed. "That's not an option," Daniel said, his deep voice carrying an edge Harriet had rarely heard from him. "Sophie carried her brother through a storm to save his life. You rip them apart now, you'll destroy both kids." Caroline's voice was calmer, but her hands gripped the edge of the table tightly. "We're not talking about 2 separate cases. We're talking about siblings, bonded, interdependent. Trauma doesn't disappear just because a placement looks better on paper." Across the room sat Evelyn Shore, the legal representative from the county. Evelyn was in her 40s, with olive-toned skin, short black hair cropped neatly, and a practical navy pantsuit. She rarely spoke unless necessary, her role primarily to observe and advise on policy. "From a legal standpoint," Evelyn interjected softly, "Harriet isn't wrong. The court always prioritizes infants because of adoption success rates. However," she looked at Sophie's file thoughtfully, "this isn't a typical case." Caroline caught that glance, holding on to the subtle lifeline Evelyn had offered. But Harriet wasn't convinced. "I'll present the recommendation to Judge Parker at the review next week," Harriet concluded, gathering her papers sharply. "If you want to challenge it, Caroline, you'll need compelling evidence." What none of them noticed was the small figure hiding just outside the conference room door. Sophie had slipped into the hallway quietly, Shadow's keen ears twitching slightly as if sensing something but not moving. Sophie pressed her tiny hand against the cool wall, her hazel eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. She had heard every word. That night, as lightning cracked above the Hendersons' pale yellow house, Sophie sat cross-legged on the edge of her bed, Noah bundled against her chest. The rain tapped against the glass, and the sound of distant thunder echoed her racing heart. Her tiny hands trembled as she whispered softly into Noah's ear, "They want to take you away from me, but I promised, Noah. I promised I'd keep you safe." By midnight, Sophie made her decision. She pulled on her small raincoat, grabbed her notebook and Noah's blanket, and carefully eased Noah into his carrier. The floor creaked as she tiptoed past the Hendersons' closed bedroom door, her small shadow disappearing into the storm. An hour later, Daniel's phone buzzed violently on his nightstand. Groggy but alert, he picked up instantly, hearing Olivia Henderson's panicked voice on the other end. "She's gone, Daniel. Sophie's gone, and Noah, too." Within minutes, Daniel and Shadow were out the door, rain soaking his jacket as Caroline pulled up in her own car. The Maple Creek Police Department mobilized quickly, setting up a grid search. Daniel coordinated with the patrol officers, his commanding presence cutting through the chaos, his voice low but firm as he radioed updates. Shadow, trained for search and rescue, sniffed Sophie's small blue blanket, then lowered his head, tracking her scent through the drenched streets. Hours passed, the storm relentless, until Shadow suddenly stiffened. His ears pricked, his nose twitching as he pulled hard against the leash. Daniel followed closely, heart pounding as the dog led them to an abandoned, weathered house on Maple Street, one Sophie had once pointed out weeks ago as the house where Mom used to tell me stories. Daniel drew his flashlight, beams slicing through the dripping darkness as Shadow scratched at the back door, whimpering softly. Caroline arrived seconds later, her breath visible in the icy night air. "Inside?" she asked urgently. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice clipped. "Shadow, sure." The door creaked open under Daniel's steady push, revealing a dim, dust-covered hallway. They moved carefully, the air damp and cold, until Shadow froze at the base of a narrow staircase. A faint whimper echoed from above. Daniel climbed slowly, his boots creaking on the warped wood, his chest tightening as he reached the attic door. He pushed it open gently, and there she was. Sophie sat curled in the farthest corner, clutching Noah so tightly against her chest that her small knuckles were white. Her hair clung in damp strands to her pale face, and her trembling lips whispered broken words between sobs. "They want to take Noah. They want to take him away from me. I promised him I'd protect him." Daniel lowered himself slowly, his tall frame folding into the cramped attic space. His voice softened, his usual commanding tone replaced by a deep, soothing warmth. "Hey, Sophie, it's okay. No one's taken Noah tonight. You're safe now." Sophie's tear-streaked face lifted slightly, hazel eyes locking onto his as if searching for the truth in his words. Daniel reached out a steady hand, his calloused fingers brushing lightly against her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured. Shadow padded forward quietly, pressing his warm body against Sophie's side. The German shepherd rested his head gently on her small lap, licking her hand with deliberate softness, grounding her in the present. Caroline entered quietly behind them, her own breath catching at the sight of Sophie's fragile frame trembling in the shadows. She knelt nearby, lowering her voice to a soothing whisper. "We'll figure this out together, sweetheart. I promise. Nobody's going to separate you two without a fight." Sophie hiccuped softly, tightening her hold on Noah but letting Daniel carefully guide her into his arms. As he lifted her, Noah stirred but did not cry, his small chest rising and falling steadily against Sophie's tiny hands. Together, they descended the creaking stairs, Shadow walking at Sophie's side like a guardian, until the storm's roar softened behind them. For tonight, at least, the siblings were safe. But everyone knew the storm inside the courtroom was still coming. The gray skies above Maple Creek parted slowly, allowing soft sunlight to filter through the lingering clouds. It had been a week since Sophie and Noah's nighttime escape, and though they were back safe at the Hendersons' home, the tension surrounding their future had not eased. At school, whispers about Sophie's story had spread quietly among the teachers and parents, about the little girl who braved a storm, clutching her newborn brother, refusing to let go no matter what. At Maple Creek Elementary, the hallways buzzed with activity. colorful paper stars dangled from the ceiling, each carrying handwritten wishes from the students. In the art room, Sophie sat at a small table, her thin shoulders hunched forward, carefully clutching a blue crayon in her tiny hand. Her hazel eyes were focused intently on the large sheet of white paper before her, where she was drawing a star-filled sky. Beside her knelt Miss Grace Miller, Sophie's art teacher, a warm and soft-spoken woman in her late 20s. Grace had shoulder-length chestnut hair pulled loosely into a half-knot, fair, freckled skin, and deep green eyes that radiated calmness. Known for her patient nature and gentle way of drawing out creativity, Grace had spent years encouraging children who struggled with emotional expression. Today, she placed a hand lightly on Sophie's back and spoke softly. "That's beautiful, Sophie. Can you tell me about these stars?" Sophie glanced up shyly, holding the silver star-shaped locket resting against her small chest. "Each one's someone I love," she murmured. Her little finger traced over the stars she had drawn carefully. "That's Noah, that's Mommy, that's Grandma, and that one's me." Her voice faltered, almost as if she feared speaking it aloud might make the stars fade away. Grace smiled softly, her voice warm and steady. "It's a constellation, then, and constellations only shine when they stay together." The drawing became the centerpiece of an upcoming event, an art exhibition hosted by Maple Creek Elementary titled Family Constellation. The principal, Mr. David Pearson, a tall man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and an approachable smile, decided the showcase would highlight the resilience of families like Sophie's. Mr. Pearson had kind gray eyes and a calm authority honed from decades of working with children. Quietly, he had coordinated with Caroline Brooks to ensure the event could also bring community attention to Sophie's situation. On the evening of the exhibition, the school gymnasium transformed into a gallery. Children's paintings lined the walls, strings of paper stars hung from the ceiling, and soft instrumental music played in the background. In the center of it all stood Sophie's artwork, the blue night sky filled with delicate stars, her carefully written title beneath it, "Our Family Together." Sophie arrived with Noah cradled gently in her arms, accompanied by Caroline and Daniel. Shadow walked closely at her side, his sleek black and tan fur shining under the gym lights, his amber eyes scanning the crowd calmly but alertly, ever protective. Sophie clutched her locket nervously as they stepped into the room filled with curious faces and murmured voices. Caroline knelt in front of her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember, sweetheart," she whispered, "tonight's about showing everyone how much you and Noah belong together." Soon, parents, teachers, and neighbors gathered around Sophie's artwork, drawn not only by the beauty of her drawing, but by the story it told. A few whispered quietly, "That's the little girl from the police report. She carried her baby brother through the storm." The words swirled, but Sophie kept her gaze fixed on Noah, holding him close as if shielding him from the weight of their curiosity. Then Mr. Pearson stepped forward and addressed the crowd, his warm baritone carrying gently through the room. "This exhibition celebrates the strength of our students, their creativity, their hope, and their resilience. Sophie Miller's story has touched many of us. Her art reminds us of one simple truth: families, like constellations, shine brightest when they stay together." The applause was soft but heartfelt. Sophie's cheeks flushed pink, and she instinctively looked down, embarrassed by the attention. Shadow nudged her leg gently, grounding her in the moment. Caroline quietly circulated a petition during the event, a formal statement urging the court to prevent Sophie and Noah from being separated. To her surprise, signatures filled the pages quickly. Teachers signed. Parents signed. Even strangers who had only heard whispers about the siblings came forward to add their names. Daniel stood near the petition table, his tall frame impossible to miss. His blue-gray eyes softened as he watched the community rally around Sophie. Shadow sat obediently at his feet, tail flicking occasionally whenever someone bent to greet him. When Caroline handed Daniel the clipboard, he added his bold signature firmly to the top of the list. By the end of the evening, over 100 signatures filled the petition. It wasn't just numbers. It was the voices of Maple Creek saying, "We will not let them be torn apart." News of the exhibition and the petition spread rapidly. Local newspapers picked up the story and social media buzzed with photos of Sophie's constellation drawing. Parents across town began calling Caroline's office, asking how they could help. The momentum became impossible to ignore, and even county officials began forwarding messages to the family court. Within days, the petition reached Judge Henry Parker, the same judge who had granted temporary custody to the Hendersons. Known for his fairness and strong sense of community values, Judge Parker reviewed the documents carefully. Seeing the unified voice of the town, he scheduled an emergency hearing to reevaluate the proposed separation. At the same time, the growing pressure forced Harriet Winters into a corner. For weeks, she had stood firm in her recommendation to separate Sophie and Noah, citing adoption statistics and resource allocation. But during a tense internal meeting, faced with Caroline's report, the petition signatures, and Daniel's testimony about Sophie's bond with her brother, Harriet's confidence finally began to crack. "This isn't policy," Harriet said stiffly, her voice losing its edge. "This is public pressure." "It's both," Caroline countered firmly, her hazel eyes unwavering. "This is a community saying they won't let trauma be doubled by tearing these kids apart." The silence stretched before Harriet finally exhaled slowly, her rigid shoulders relaxing slightly. "Then I'll withdraw my recommendation," she admitted, though her tone carried reluctance. Caroline nodded faintly, but didn't celebrate. She knew this wasn't over. It was only the first victory in a longer battle. That night, as Caroline drove Sophie and Noah back to the Hendersons' home, Shadow lay across the back seat with his head resting on Sophie's small lap. She traced the edges of her locket absent-mindedly while Noah slept peacefully beside her. For the first time in weeks, the storm within her chest seemed to quiet just enough for hope to break through. Through Sophie's art, a town had found its voice. Through the town's voice, Sophie and Noah had found their chance. For now, the stars in her constellation still shined together. The air in the Maple Creek family court was tense, heavy with anticipation. Sunlight filtered faintly through the tall arched windows, casting narrow beams across the polished wooden floor. Rows of wooden benches were filled with familiar faces, teachers, neighbors, and members of the community who had rallied behind Sophie and Noah. Caroline Brooks sat near the front, her hazel eyes focused sharply, while Officer Daniel Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression steady yet watchful. At his feet, Shadow, the black and tan German shepherd, lay calmly but alert, amber eyes scanning the room, ready to move if Sophie needed comfort. Judge Henry Parker, a man in his early 60s with thinning silver hair and thoughtful brown eyes, entered the courtroom and settled into his seat at the bench. Known for his calm demeanor and a deep sense of fairness, Parker's presence commanded respect. He wore his black robe lightly, his tall frame slightly hunched forward as he reviewed the final reports. Caroline whispered quietly to Sophie, who sat between her and Laura, with Noah's small carrier resting by their feet. Sophie's tiny fingers clutched the silver star-shaped locket tightly, her hazel eyes darting nervously around the packed room. Laura, sitting to her right, brushed a trembling strand of auburn hair behind her ear and rested a comforting hand on Sophie's back. Though Laura had regained some of her strength since beginning treatment at Sunrise Recovery Center, her pale complexion and weary eyes still bore the marks of her battles. The proceedings began with Harriet Winters, the senior child welfare supervisor, presenting her updated recommendation. Today, Harriet looked different, softer, almost humbled. Her usual rigid posture was there, but her icy blue eyes lacked their former edge. She wore a gray blazer over a pale cream blouse, and for the first time in months, she set her file on the table without defensiveness. "Your Honor," Harriet began, her voice steady but measured. After reviewing updated reports, recent community petitions, and conducting further home evaluations, I am withdrawing my recommendation for separate placements. In light of recent evidence, we now believe Sophie and Noah's best interests lie in remaining together. A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel exhaled quietly, glancing down at Shadow, who twitched an ear as though sensing his handler's relief. Caroline rose next, adjusting her blazer, her voice clear and firm. "Your Honor, Sophie and Noah have endured extraordinary circumstances. Sophie, at only 6 years old, has demonstrated responsibility far beyond her years, caring for her brother, surviving instability, and holding on to hope even when resources failed her. But she should never have had to carry that weight. The support of this community, her foster family, and now her mother demonstrates that Sophie and Noah deserve stability together, not separation." Judge Parker nodded thoughtfully before turning his gaze to Laura. "Miss Miller," he said gently, "before I make my ruling, I'd like to hear from you directly." Laura stood slowly, smoothing her plain navy dress with trembling hands. Her auburn braid rested over her shoulder, and faint freckles dotted her pale skin. She clasped her hands in front of her and looked up at the judge with tearful hazel eyes that mirrored Sophie's. "Your Honor," she began softly, her voice shaky but steadying with each word, "I made mistakes. I left when I should have stayed. But I needed help. I wasn't the mother they deserved. Now I've been in treatment for over 8 months. I've rebuilt my life piece by piece, and every choice I make is for Sophie and Noah." She paused, her lips trembling as she glanced at her daughter. "All I want is to be their mom again, to give them the childhood I almost took away." Sophie looked up at her mother silently, her small chest rising and falling quickly. Shadow nudged her knee gently, grounding her as Daniel crouched nearby, quietly watching. The final testimony came from Robert Henderson, the retired music teacher who had fostered Sophie and Noah with his wife Olivia. Robert was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his soft-spoken nature made every word resonate. Standing near the witness stand, he folded his calloused hands and addressed the court. "Sophie and Noah have been a blessing in our home. They deserve stability, love, and continuity. My wife and I support reunification fully, and we've promised to serve as emergency guardians should anything happen. These children, deserve to grow up together." The judge sat silently for a long moment after Robert's words. The quiet stretched across the room, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and Noah's tiny coo from his carrier. Finally, Judge Parker spoke, his voice firm yet warm. "This court recognizes the extraordinary resilience of these children, the dedication of their caregivers, and the overwhelming support of the Maple Creek community." He glanced down at Sophie, then back at Laura. "I hereby rule that Sophie and Noah Miller shall be reunified with their mother, Miss Laura Miller, under a structured transition plan effective immediately." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes as she reached for Sophie's hand. Daniel exhaled sharply, placing a hand on Shadow's back, while the dog's tail thumped softly against the floor. The judge continued, his tone careful and deliberate. "Margaret Carter," he added, referencing Sophie's grandmother, "shall retain supervised visitation rights once weekly, given her cognitive challenges. And should the need arise, Robert and Olivia Henderson will remain designated as emergency caregivers." The gavel came down with a soft, definitive thud. For the first time in months, Sophie's small shoulders seemed to relax. She leaned against Laura's side, her little fingers tracing the edges of her locket, as if silently acknowledging the constellation she had fought so hard to keep intact. 3 months later. The small blue house on Maple Street no longer looked like the place Sophie remembered from before. Fresh white paint brightened the siding, the porch swing had been repaired, and yellow daisies bloomed brightly in a neat row beneath the windows, a tribute to Laura's promise of a new beginning. On the warm spring afternoon, Sophie sat on the wooden swing, her bare feet dangling above the freshly cut grass as she held Noah on her lap. Laura knelt nearby, adjusting a loose board on the porch step, her auburn braid catching the sunlight. Beside her, Margaret Carter, Sophie's grandmother, sat in a wicker chair, her silver hair glowing under the fading light. Though Margaret's memory still drifted on some days, she looked peaceful now, humming softly to herself as she rocked gently. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Sophie glance up. Daniel stepped out, his tall figure casting a long shadow against the walkway. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and dark jeans, his blue-gray eyes soft as they landed on Sophie. Shadow trotted at his side, his thick black and tan coat shining as he padded across the grass before settling comfortably by Sophie's feet. Sophie reached down, running her small hand along Shadow's fur, her lips curling into a tiny, contented smile. Looking up at the twilight sky, she spotted a single bright star emerging in the dusky purple. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but everyone on the porch heard it. "Our constellation," she murmured. "Finally, it's back together." Laura placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, her own gaze lifting toward the star-studded sky. For the first time in years, the Miller family sat together beneath the same horizon. Whole, safe, and finally home. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest burdens, but even in the darkest storms, God reminds us that miracles still exist. Sophie believed her constellation was broken forever, but through love, faith, and the kindness of a community, God placed every missing star back where it belonged. Life isn't always easy. We all face nights that feel endless, battles that seem impossible, and moments when hope feels out of reach. But this story reminds us, no storm lasts forever, no prayer goes unheard, and no heart is too broken for God to heal. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that families deserve to stay together, If you believe that God's love can guide us through even our darkest days, then this story is your reminder. Miracles are real. May God bless you and your loved ones. Share this video so more people can feel this hope. Comment below where you're watching from and leave your prayers for Sophie, Noah, and families like theirs. And don't forget to subscribe. Together, we can spread stories of faith, hope, and love to the world. Because sometimes all it takes is a little faith and a miracle you never saw coming.